want to introduce the moderator of the last panel. Really pleased that Jim Tankersley can join us. Jim is an economics correspondent for the National Journal, and before that he was with the Tribune Washington Bureau, Chicago Tribune, where he covered energy, environment, and politics, and also for the New York Times, for the LA Times and Tribune. He previously worked at the Toledo Blade, the Rocky Mountain News, and the Oregonian. He and his colleagues won the 2007 Livingston Award for Young Journalists for their business as usual story about the true roots of Ohio's economic decline. And he's also, his team was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for a study that they did as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for hanging with us till the end of the day. I promise that this is the best panel. I'm going to say that now. I'm guaranteeing victory. It's really a crack group of gentlemen that we have up here, and I want to take a very quick moment to introduce them to you. Ted Nordhaus is the chairman of Breakthrough Institute, author, researcher, political strategist, general environmental iconoclast, and really one of the most forward-thinking and challenging environmental thinkers out there. Stephen Hayward is a fellow in law and economics at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., which happens to be, as an economics reporter, one of my favorite think tanks. So he basically does a ridiculous variety of topics, but he is a co-author of this fabulous study with Mark Miro, who you just saw, and the Breakthrough guys, that I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more about. Josh Freed and I actually go way back to my Colorado days. He's the director of the Clean Energy Program at Third Way, which is a centrist Democratic think tank here in D.C. He is a very keen political thinker, but also just a very studied and innovative energy thinker, and happy to have him here. And then we have two of the better, again, we're raising the bar here, probably the two best congressional staff members we could have gotten, let's be clear. Neil Brown is the senior advisor to Senator Dick Lugar on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I could spend literally all afternoon listing off his accomplishments for you, but he is responsible for energy security and the non-Lugar non-proliferation program. He has a master's in political theory and was a Rhodes Scholar, so he's going to make the rest of us feel kind of dumb today. And then John Epstein is the staff member for Jeff Bingaman on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He performs oversight of energy research and development and DOE matters for the committee, as well as DOD, nuclear weapons, and non-proliferation issues. He has a PhD in engineering science and applied mechanics, and was a postdoctorate fellow at Oxford. So again, those of us here with bachelor's degrees are feeling a little out of our element. Anyway, let's get started on the panel with the question, and then we're looking forward to questions from you. But the point of this panel is to talk about politics, and specifically how do we reach some sort of a consensus to advance an energy innovation agenda through Congress, the White House, federal policy. And I just want to start out, gentlemen, with a very basic question: if we're going to move forward, we have to agree as a Congress, as a country, on some basic principles, political principles, policy principles. What do those need to be? What does consensus look like in the energy space in terms of what we're driving forward? And we'll start with you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jim. I think it's great. It's a great place to start the conversation, and I think I've had the sense of the earlier panels kind of itching to kind of get to this question. Started to kind of creep back into some of the earlier discussions, so I'm glad we get to just put it on the table now and talk about it. I think there's a couple of things that we need to get sort of clear about. I think that the first is that, I think we're at the very beginnings of really rethinking what a sort of effective national energy innovation program needs to look like. We've had a couple of decades now where the dominant assumptions have been that whether through pricing or regulatory means, a cap and trade program, a carbon tax, something else, that we would sort of put the rules of the game in place and the private sector would do the innovating. And I think what we are seeing today, and I think it's reflected in some part by the tremendous turnout for this conference and this discussion, has been a realization that it's a lot more complicated than that, and that we need a much more sophisticated understanding of how energy innovation happens, how we drive that. So I think the first thing is that the famous college basketball coach John Wooden used to advise his charges to be quick, but don't be in a hurry. And I think we need to take the time to figure out how we actually do energy innovation right. And I think over a couple of decades, there's been a lot of thought about how you sort of design a market-based cap and trade program, for instance. I think there's been a lot less thought, both sort of institutionally and programmatically, how you actually do energy innovation effectively. And I think we need to take the time to figure that out. Now, that said, I think there is a lot of ground and a strong basis for consensus on a bipartisan and sustained basis. That once we stop trying to agree on what the problem is and start just thinking about sort of what are the solutions, I think there's a lot more agreement on energy innovation and the need for energy innovation than there is on how serious a problem climate change is, or how much drilling we should do in the Gulf, or any number of the other issues that have really polarized the Congress and the political and the polity. So I think that I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that you start to see the outlines of that when we start focusing not only on research and development, but demonstration of new technologies, sort of very targeted procurement as opposed to sort of across the board subsidies of technologies. I think there's a whole set of places we can go where there really is, I think, a willingness on both sides of the aisle to sort of start to move towards a different paradigm of driving energy innovation in the U.S. So I'll stop there for now.
Steve, can we just keep moving down here in the middle?
Okay. Well, I think maybe as a card-carrying member of the vast right-wing conspiracy, I ought to play the scold just a little bit. I tend to be, and I'm an academic political scientist, so I tend to be a little bit, have a little bit of a jaundiced view about bipartisan consensus, because too often it means the lowest common denominator of deal making. You all know the story that's probably apocryphal but has the ring of truthiness to it, as the comedy guys say, of the Russian who came to visit the U.S. Senate about 1991 when Russia's trying to emerge from communism and saying, please explain two-party system. You know the story? You guys know the story? He's talking to a Republican Senate aide and says, explain the two-party system. He says, well, it's really pretty simple. We have in America the evil party and the stupid party. Being Republican, naturally, I'm part of the stupid party. And we fight each other against our evil and stupidity. But every once in a while, we get together and do something really stupid and evil, and we call that bipartisanship. And so for that backdrop, I pick up the newspaper the other day and I see where Senator Kerry and Lieberman say, we want to do an energy bill. We think it's going to happen this next year. And of course, there's no bill yet, but the brief squib said the same things you've heard before. We'll have some loan guarantees for nuclear. We'll have tax credits for wind and solar. We'll have research for biofuels. By the time you get Senator Murkowski to sign on, now that she's survived the Iced Tea Party challenge in Alaska, she'll probably want some oil and gas drilling. And it'll be the same kind of thing we've seen in all the energy bills going back for 30 years. And that would be a defeat, because I think if there's anything that both our report is suggesting and this conference is suggesting is, if bipartisanship means the business as usual horse trading, we will have failed. That's not what we're talking about. How do you get genuine breakthroughs of what Stephen Jay Gould in another context called the punctuated equilibrium, when you actually break off in a new direction? There are a few examples in social policy of the last 20 and 30 years you can look at, and then I'll sort of think quickly about what are the conditions that would make this happen for energy. One would have been welfare reform in the 1990s, which followed the model suggested by a couple speakers earlier. I think Bert Richter, coming up from the state level. I think it's harder with energy than it was with welfare, but never mind that for now. But the point is coming from the bottom up. In other words, if we leave it to the people in this town to give us new energy policy, we're not likely to get much that's going to impress us very much. So the point is that lots more agitation like this meeting, say more of that kind of thing. There's some other models. Tax reform of 1986, something I studied very closely because I write a lot of policy history, is something that really there was no reason for it to have happened the way it did, with a real bipartisan effort of a radical change in tax policy. And how that happened is quite an interesting story. I think that so what would create the conditions for that to happen in energy? Well, one of them that also is similar to the tax story, Armin Cohen suggested in the last panel. We have a stagnant economy. We need to get things growing again. The president has said just the other day in the context of this fight over extending the Bush tax cuts, maybe we ought to have wholesale tax reform. It seems to me that the door is now open for putting the whole problem we now face into, let's get pro-growth policy back. And there, I think there is room for some horse trading between left and right that would give each side some of the things they really want. That would include energy as a big part of it. Tax reform to give us pro-growth tax code as opposed to one now that is really quite perverse in a lot of ways. Some regulatory changes of various kinds. And within all that, I think an energy innovation agenda could play a prominent role. And by the way, Armin, if you're still here, the Wall Street Journal loves that idea in general and has said a couple of times that there is a role in energy for the government to play similar to the role they played in the NIH. And I like to point that out to people who are cross with me for the work I've done with Ted and Michael and Mark. And then the last thing I'll say, so in energy, I think, actually I won't go off to now what the conditions might be in the current year or the long game I'm suggesting. But I will say that the lesson you take away from the work that led to the Post-Partisan Power Report, which I think it's an interesting story, I think, that I love telling reporters because it was a year and a half long process. But the takeaway is what was required to get to the point where people from various points in the political spectrum could sign on with enthusiasm to the report that we put out is that what was required was a lot of long conversations and genteel argument. And that is something that doesn't take place in this town very often, and it certainly can't take place in 6-minute segments on cable TV. But I think that sort of process needs to be replicated again and again on this issue and on others, by the way. And I think we've been talking already about what's our second round. What will Post-Partisan Power 2 be, hopefully a year now or sooner. And it's going to be to continue exhausting day-long working group meetings where we're all really exhausted by the end of the day, but where we really spend a lot of time saying, Ted, here's what I think is bad about that idea. And Ted says back, maybe you're right, but here's some examples of where it's worked. And I say back to him, let me read the paper. And the next week we say, yeah, that's a good point. And we move it forward slowly and patiently in as I say, a format that doesn't happen very often. And work partly in this case because we become friends, but also because we don't represent constituency groups. We represent idea organizations, which is always a problem if you're a member of an organized interest group, whether it's for industry or for environmentalism or so forth. I can say more, but that's enough for now.
Thank you. Josh, can you talk to us a little bit about the pragmatism of third way is, if nothing, not pragmatist. So tell me, sort of from a pragmatic standpoint, where can we find this common ground?
Well, I think, first of all, as we've worked with a lot of Senate offices who aren't on the Energy Committee and don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about the day-to-day of energy issues, there is a reality that there's no common understanding or definition of what energy innovation is or what it would mean to their state or district. And I think that to start, but we all, and this conference does a really good job at laying the groundwork for this, we do need to spend more time painting that picture for the policymakers of what energy innovation means, what is the time frame to get it done, and what are the real implications for energy information for members of Congress's constituencies so that they can actually care about it, so they understand what we're trying to galvanize them for and justifying the cost and the policy changes we're all talking about. The other challenge is, I think that Steve's right that it is a partisan issue often, and woe is to many about getting the stupid and the evil together, but it's just as much a regional issue. And looking at the names of the folks who did, from our perspective, very good work in trying to advance some sort of climate effort in the last 2 years, Kerry, Lieberman, Boxer, Waxman, Markey. There's a fair amount of the country that's left off of those off that list. And if we're going to get any sort of action on energy innovation or any other efforts over the next 2 years and even beyond, these ideas need to start from the center of the country, the Midwest, that's going to benefit from manufacturing, but also faces the greatest challenges with the reliance on coal. The Southeast, where they face similar challenges with renewables, and there is a lot more reluctance to engage in the kind of government involvement that may be necessary.
Perfect segue. Neil, talk to us from a Midwestern perspective here. Where does this come from?
Well, yeah, the big climate bill certainly didn't have anyone from the middle of the country signed up, and I think that part of the problem we had over the last couple of years was that the discussion got consumed by the climate debate that was very narrowly defined. It was defined as if you're going to deal with climate, you're going to have a cap and trade, and a few people had permutations on it. But this is essentially what we're going to talk about now. And what that did was exclude a large number of people who have other interests in energy. Now, I'm not talking about specific corporations and interest groups as we normally would think about them, but people who look at the energy problem and say, yes, I'm concerned about climate, or at least I'm interested in climate. I'm interested really in energy security, or I'm interested in the economic consequences of our current energy situation. So I'm actually extremely optimistic that over the next Congress that we actually have a great opportunity to widen the discussion again, to bring in people with multiple points of view and multiple goals, because a lot of the solutions are overlapping, but it's very difficult to get to that overlap in a policy sense if you are called a heretic because you ask a few questions about the science around climate change. I think we have to allow for a polity that has democratic disagreement. The second thing I'd say about getting there is that we need to really talk about what people are asking for, what they need, what they want. And that's the good thing about working in Congress, is that you get to work at the intersection of both politics and policy. And the politics of this country are clear. I mean, the number one priority is the economy. Of course, if you're a kind of a cheap politician, then that just means that every policy proposal you put out there is suddenly a jobs bill. Well, it's not just about jobs. It's about the competitiveness of this country. So we really need to prioritize those policies that will help unleash that investment, that will make this country more competitive economically, and energy is a huge part of that. The third thing I'd say is that I think that this last election has given us a very good reminder that government is not the solution to everything. Government has a very necessary role in spurring innovation, in research and training, in correcting specific market failures. But we've seen a round rejection of the notion that a massive bill, a massive plan will simply reorient the economy. I think rather we need to take a very practical approach that's incremental, that is identifying specific failures that only the government can correct, or at least only the government can correct on a time frame that is acceptable, given other security consequences or climate consequences, whatever they are.
John, politics is the art of the possible.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of down in the trenches, so it's rare when I poke my head up here. I guess I can look at where we ended up this Congress and where we started out, and I just jotted down a few things. And of course, I channel through Jeff Bingaman, right? I'm your nameless staffer type. Jeff always says that, and he's been around 30 years now, Congress can only do one or two big things. So you got to pick your poison at a leadership level and debate it. And if you look at what we did, the one or two big things, what were they? Well, I mean, it depends on whether they were, you frame it as one or two good big things, I don't know, but there was the health care and the banking bill. He was right. So the next Congress, you have to pick one or two big things that the Congress can chew through, and these are only Senate staffers here. You have a whole other chamber that is not represented in this discussion. And I don't know what they are. You know, it's something to do with the economy, I suppose, you know, something to do for sure with the deficit. Where is energy going to fit in there? I don't know. I think, you know, you just have to get back to where the leadership is framing the debate. Now, I think some other points need to be thought about too, since I've done a couple of these energy bills. You know, this is an innovation conference. You know, energy innovation is kind of a little bit different than an energy bill. Okay, those people probably all know that. That's kind of obvious. But, you know, I do the innovation thing or the R&D thing, and that's usually one title of a multi-title bill that develops a whole scheme of incentives to promote different forms of energy. There are multiple titles. And so I think, you know, this conference should give thought perhaps to that energy innovation is terribly important, but it's a subset of usually what we call the larger energy bills in this place. I can frame what happened to an energy bill in this Congress from Senator Bingaman's perspective. You know, we did report a good bipartisan energy bill. We had a good heave-ho in the committee. We had Jeff Sessions vote for it, as well as Lisa Murkowski, and I think. But we only do energy-only bills. Okay, we're the kind of left side of the equation. In this Congress, we tried to deal with the right side of the equation, and that was the climate change debate and how to put a price on carbon to free up a lot of technologies, you know, to free up all that capital on the sidelines. And that's where we got hung up. Jeff always tells the story when he came first into the Congress in the early 80s. In the Reagan administration, he worked with the Reagan administration in New Mexico and actually got several million acres, he says, of BLM land, almost declared a wilderness. But the environmental community wanted more, almost a perfect solution. And thing cratered. In the energy bill this Congress, I think you all know the story, we had an energy bill. Many people wanted to bring that to the floor, but we were bound in a much larger climate debate. What this next Congress holds, I think you need to just circle back to what Jeff says is a typical session of Congress, or two sessions, can only do one or two big things. And where energy bills fit in that debate, I don't know yet, to be quite honest. We have new members coming in. I think Republican leader McConnell has said energy is a possibility that he could do. He was quoted as saying that. And I think a lot of reasons he says that is because he knows, at least in our energy committee, we tend to work in a fairly bipartisan fashion. But please just let me go back to it. It's one or two big things in a Congress, and that is a TBD question.
All right, I appreciate everybody's sort of opening salves here. So now let's delve into some of the details, and I'll direct these kind of individually. First off, short term, we will be dealing with the Congress next year with a House Republican majority that, by and large, is skeptical or outright dismissive of the science of climate change, and where very clearly the ethic will be cut spending and can cut it by a lot, as opposed to spend new money on anything. So I think the first question, and I'll toss this to whoever wants to take it. Is it possible to get any kind of energy innovation, any of the sort of things we've been hearing about all day that all cost money, done in the next 2 years?
Well, I'll give it a whirl. It's already been suggested a little bit of McConnell mentioning this might be a place to work. There's going to be, in general terms, enormous pressure on the president, on Republicans, to prove they can govern together on something. They're going to fight like hell about the healthcare business. That's going to be a fight that's going to go on forever. The spending is going to be episodic, but you know, energy might be. This is the optimistic case. Energy might be the one place that would be safe to reach a deal and come together on something. What the outlines of it might be, whether it's sort of conventional, as I've been sort of dismissing as being suboptimal, probably the most likely way. The other thing that could happen is if we got a return of $4 a gallon gasoline by next summer, that would raise the salience of it and immediately put energy back on the top of that list of a big thing we want to do.
But to push back on that just for a second, I mean,
Sure.
the idea that more expensive gas, or even the President and Republicans looking for areas to work together, will somehow yield a spending bill that spends more on innovation. Make that math add up for me.
Here's how that would work, I think. I've been saying for a while that if we'd had $4 a gallon gasoline the last year and a half, you would have seen drill baby drill signs at all the Tea Party rallies. By the way, somebody mentioned having an energy party. It takes 75 BTUs to heat a cup of tea. So you want to tell those folks that's the energy literacy. However, even if you have a revival of drill baby drill enthusiasm, there are enough Republicans and conservatives, and even I think some of the Tea Party people who understand that's not a complete policy. And as a practical matter, you'd have to have another side to that, because even if you, well, you know the argument about why it wouldn't actually change the dynamics of the oil market, but as a practical matter in politics, you need to have another side to that package, and that's the opening for energy innovation. And so the spending part, that's going to be problematic, but what you see in the dynamics of this tax bill right now that everyone's unhappy about is that sometimes when there's something you really want a lot, you'll take the other side that you're less enthusiastic about.
Right. Go ahead.
I think, I hope Steve's right, and I think there's reason for optimism that the Senate could do something. I think that moving anything through the House over the next years is going to be much more difficult. You have a huge number of Tea Party or Tea Party aligned members who do feel that they were elected in part because of cap and trade, regardless of the reality of that or not, and who I don't think are all that literate yet on energy policy, have given any thought to it, and just want to cut spending. And so you've got this worst combination for those of us who are advocating energy innovation of a large bloc that may dictate a significant part of the Republican caucus in the House who think energy policy is climate related and they're not so thrilled with that, really want to slash government, really want to slash spending, and aren't really thinking or don't have any motivation to look long term about where they want the country to go on this issue.
I want to broaden that just a touch. People keep bringing up the Tea Party. Ted, can you talk about, is there grassroots foundation there for innovation? I mean, is there an innovation undercurrent in Congress right now? And if not, how do you get there?
Well, I mean, I think, there's a question of sort of public opinion and elite opinion, and then what members of Congress are thinking about. And those are all sort of related, but not the same thing. I think there is a long-standing overwhelming majority of Americans who have again and again and again told pollsters that they supported energy innovation and were ready to pay for it, and we're ready to pay substantially for it. When you sort of limit it to just the question of energy R&D, even when you're putting sort of fairly substantial price tags on that, you're talking 80 to 90% majorities of the American public that support doing that. And again, they don't all support it for the same reasons. Some people care about global warming. Some people care about gas prices. Some people think there's economic opportunity. Some all of the above. But that consensus has been extremely durable. I think that you are seeing, you have also seen a fairly long-standing sort of elite consensus that we needed to do something about a whole set of issues around sort of energy technology, dependence on oil, a whole set of those things. I think then you get to Congress and, as I think Josh and others described, you get a whole set of ideological and regional interests that come into play and have tended often to kind of sort of distort that into sort of unrecognizable policy when there was even an effort to do anything on a policy level at all. But I think that we have all of the ingredients for a sort of lasting sort of consensus around this stuff if we can kind of get the sort of framing of this right. And I think that starts, first of all, with Michael and I wrote a piece last spring called about the need to free energy from energy policy from the climate debate. I think we're going to move in that direction. The climate debate has been intensely polarizing. Energy debate has also been polarized at times, but not in the same ways. And I think if you look at the sort of history of the Energy Committee and the history of actually Congress passed bipartisan bills, energy bills, you see that. I think there's a question of where's the money going to come from, and I think if you're focused on how you can do a major sort of step change increase in energy innovation funding in the next year, that's that's a challenge. But I think we need to have a much longer term perspective on this, and I think over the longer haul, I think the prospects for a significant expansion of sort of federal investment in energy innovation are pretty good. But I think that starts with getting clear about what it is that we need to do. I think once we can identify a set of things that we can agree, on both sides of the aisle, even for very different reasons, are worth doing, I think we tend to find the money to do those things. My kind of counsel, as we've talked to folks in Congress, to other folks interested in this stuff, is let's slow down enough to figure out what it is that we think we can agree that, at least broadly, we need to do, and then let's figure out how we can agree to do that, and then we can start the conversation about how to pay for it. And I think once you approach it in that way, there's lots of ways to pay for it, and we can probably find some mix of sources of revenue, whether it's revenue from offshore leasing or some subsidy reform or a wires fee. There's lots of ideas out there about how to raise the money, but I think those are all non-starters until we get some consensus on what it is we actually want to do.
And I want to go back over to John, to the question about Senator Bingaman's calculations on big things and little things. Does energy innovation have to be a big thing, or?
Oh no. It's it's a big thing here, obviously. I always tell the story. I remember when we passed the Competes bill, right? So that was something in 2007, not. And I remember at the end of it, Jeff went up to our press guy and said, well, is any reporting on this? So we had to get our press guy, Bill Wicker, to go knock on doors. And I think Krondaki, I can't say Morton, Kondraki, yeah, I think he finally ended up doing something on it. But that was in the tailspin of the rising above the gathering storm. But when we passed the bill, energy innovation is a big thing, but it's in a bigger context of an energy bill. And I think when I look at various reports come out, I do remember that this number seems to be bouncing around of like 14 to 16 billion. Is that the right number? I see them, and they all seem to be bouncing around on that number. Jeff, he tends to look at a more holistic picture on the whole thing. I think Rob Atkinson would channel on this, but he says don't necessarily look at the discretionary spending element. That's obviously important, and that obviously translates into grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, and other transactions, and it goes on to spur innovation in a cost-shared way with industry, which, et cetera, goes down the rabbit trail. He says look at the entire picture of tax incentives plus innovation, because he feels and has told kind of large industry groups that come in that it's easier in Congress right now, as you've just seen, to get large tax breaks through. This latest one was what, like 900 billion or something like that. I don't know what it was. I'm not the tax guy. It was trillion. Yeah, it was huge. And he says, look at the entire picture of discretionary spending and tax incentives, and then go from there as to how that can spur innovation. So I think it's somewhat incorrect to just say 14 to 16 billion and we'll build it into the budget resolution and then add that to the appropriations accounts and away we go, because as people know, we're in a very scary deficit-ridden climate. Not that tax incentives are any better, but I do think that you need to look at the entire picture, and that's what Jeff says. It's a more fuller picture that way, and there's R&D tax credits that can be enabled and helped, as well as just the pure discretionary spending element.
And Neil, we talk a little bit about talk about regulation, which was a central component of Senator Lugar's energy bill that he put forward, new efficiency regulations and trying to drive innovation that way. Because you don't just get innovation by investing in it, you could also get it by forcing it. But the new Republicans on the Hill seem to be just as opposed to the idea of more government regulation as they are to the idea of more government spending. And I'm wondering, do you see a place in the discussion for a similar type of bill in this coming year as the one that Senator Lugar introduced last year?
Yeah, I guess I would probably characterize Senator Lugar's bill slightly differently. Clearly, we had some regulatory elements of it, but by and large, it was an incentive approach. Essentially, we sort of tried to do the bipartisan work of pulling from both sides of the aisle to come up with a package that would actually deliver results, and so McKinsey modeled it out, and you could get your results. But I mean, I think it gets to the point that it's not just about money. I mean, there are lots of ways to encourage innovation, and there is room for regulation in fixing very specific failures in the market. I mean, you could put a very substantial price on carbon, and you're still not going to solve the problem that new home construction tends to go up before there's a buyer. Therefore, the developer is not going to make the higher end energy retrofits or investments that would pay for themselves and that a consumer normally would buy because they would pay back over those few years. These sorts of things, unfortunately, and I do mean unfortunately. I mean, as a fairly conservative person, I would prefer not to embrace building codes. But the fact of the matter is that those are actually demonstrated to be quite effective in encouraging the investments we need. And it's not a matter of, sometimes there's this perception that, oh, well, the government's going to tell you what to buy tomorrow. That's obviously not the case at all. In fact, what you're doing is putting markers out there over the long term and building in as much flexibility as possible. And if there is going to be a market, then investments will be made to meet that market. I mean, it's sort of obvious.
Josh, one of the things that we often think about when we think about policy are centrists, particularly the talk right now, centrists, the middle, charting a course for agreement, compromise. Much of the middle, however, on the Democratic and the Republican side, includes a lot of senators and House members from fossil fuel states or fossil fuel dependent states. And how does that factor into the search for an innovation policy, and how do you have to factor that in when you think about laying the groundwork for one going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is we need to break out of the Washington mindset, which I'm certainly guilty of looking at everything within a Congress or an election cycle. We've talked a lot about how long it takes to innovate and get to the point where new technologies are ready for deployment, let alone commercialization. And there are small steps that we can take over the next couple of years legislatively that will help lay that groundwork. But part of what we need to do is also really begin the dialogue and show that there's a desire for it and the benefits of innovation wherever you are. Particularly for the Midwest, it's recognizing that coal is going to be there for a while, and that we need to figure out a way to first, as I think Mr. Lugar's bill started to do, create a glide path to move the oldest, least efficient, highest emitting coal plants offline and provide incentives for the private sector to get other plants that are emitting less, that embrace newer technologies online. We have to recognize that certain technologies are going to need significant government investment that will benefit the middle of the country. CCS, for example, is a good one. And also look at other opportunities such as rebuilding the manufacturing base. One of the things that Third Way has been faced challenges within the progressive community about is we are strong advocates of nuclear energy, both because it's a clean baseload source of energy, but also it holds the prospect for an enormous number of jobs, and you get 8 or 10 new plants under construction, and you can have significant amounts of high-skilled labor back in the manufacturing sector in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, forging the parts that nuclear plants are going to require. And those are processes in manufacturing that we did from 1967 to 1977, dominated the world in a lot of cases. But because of the shuttering of the nuclear industry here, or the new build, we've lost those skills. But it's pretty clear that if we do it domestically again and build new plants, those are jobs that actually can come back.
But you're a campaign guy, right? I mean, you were in your past life.
Amongst many hats, yes. Yes. I hope I've been able to shed that to some extent.
Yeah. I'm not going to let you right now. I'm going to make you, in fact, let's return to your ghost of campaigns past, right? You don't, I mean, we do not see the same sort of heat and light around energy among constituents on the campaign trail that you do around the economy right now, or you do around healthcare or social issues.
Well, I mean, look, energy on its own as an amorphous issue, as long as people's lights go on, they're happy. And so there isn't much demand, particularly at the moment, for energy reform for its own sake. It's a commodity. It is. People aren't looking for clean energy in most cases in the same way they get excited about an iPod or an iPhone coming out, or another consumer product, or the jump from turboprop planes to jet planes. But they do understand the more fundamental idea of American entrepreneurialism, to steal a term that Mr. Pence is using a lot now, American exceptionalism. And the idea that we are a country of tinkerers and innovators, and that if we put our minds to it, we can really tackle a problem and dominate it and result in a lot of economic growth and new jobs. And that's where energy fits in for our standpoint. And we did focus groups around the country, and even in the most depressed parts of Michigan, where folks that we talked to saw, plant after plant leave, they'd get a new job, and then that plant would leave as well. We expected them to throw their hands up and say, we give up. America just can't compete. And even there, and these were all moderate to conservative voters, they said, look, get it. We can compete with anything. We just need companies to come in and give us the opportunity. And sure, clean energy sounds like a really good opportunity to do that.
Please. Ted, go ahead. Yep.
I have to say, I actually think that it's quite the opposite. In every focus group I've been in over the last couple of years, when you start talking to people about the economy and what kind of things would get the economy actually moving again, about the first thing that most people will tell you is sort of some version of clean energy manufacturing and technology. Now, in some cases, I think that's been oversold to the public certainly as a short-term balm for the nation's economic problems. But actually, I think that whether it's, sort of concern about rising gasoline prices, dependence on foreign oil, sort of a desire to find drivers for new economic growth and jobs, I think actually sort of energy technology and what we're sort of broadly here calling an energy innovation is at about the top of the list for an enormous number of voters. I don't actually think that's the problem here. I think it's that we've been, we've been sort of, over the last couple of years, that whole thing got kind of sucked into the climate debate, which was not particularly helpful. I think sort of secondly, I think what happens in Congress is a little disconnected from sort of that sort of public vision of what a serious commitment to remaking the nation's sort of energy technology might look like. And I think the Congress has been, both on the liberal side, sort of obsessed with kind of cap and trade legislation, on the conservative side, kind of insistent that the government has no role in any of this. And I think once we kind of step away a little bit from those positions, there's actually a lot more common ground that actually might serve both parties sort of politically in terms of actually sort of giving the public the kinds of commitment to a better energy future that they want.
One point on the where the public is from our polling. I mean, I think the public is very receptive to it, and when you explain it to them, they get it and they're supportive of it. I mean, in at least the polling and the focus groups we did, there are several steps to get to that point in the process, and so I think that there's more groundwork that we need to do to have the kind of support for long-term clean energy innovation that I think we all agree to.
Steve?
My own opinion is that the whole green jobs enthusiasm was one of another of the serial blunders of the environmental movement of the last few years, and I think a lot of politicians looked stupid who got sucked into it. But it raises a substantive point about something that's been troubling me a bit all day.
Can we stop it? Can you explain why it was such a blunder, in your opinion?
Yes, I'm about to.
Please.
And then by raising a substantive point. Which state has the lowest unemployment rate in the country right now? Anyone know? North Dakota. Texas is actually about 2 points below the national. North Dakota's unemployment rate right now is about 3.6%. Now, only 5 people live in North Dakota. I understand that. But they're all employed doing what? Oil and gas. They're having a huge boom in oil and gas up there. Guess what? If you actually want energy jobs, they're in conventional energy, which requires skilled labor. Nuclear would do the same thing, as you were pointing out. The problem with the green jobs is, and here's one of the problems, is okay, so we can invent lots of high-tech gizmos. Well, actually, let's stick with windmills for a minute. You saw Senator Schumer was shocked to discover that a lot of the money in the stimulus for windmills was going to Chinese manufacturers, and not much to people here. Well, we can design these things here, but where are we building them? Building them over there. Why? Because the labor's cheaper. One of the problems that has to be thought through on innovation and also manufacturing across the board is, where do we have the advantage where our skilled labor, at our high labor rates here, because we're a wealthier country, where they can't compete with us with lower wage rates or even increasingly skilled labor that they have in other Asian countries. This is going to be a problem with energy innovation, as we may come up with some great technologies, but the Chinese will be able to undercut us with more materials because they've got the raw materials there that otherwise we're going to have to import, right? Lithium for batteries. We have one lithium mine in this country, by the way. So that's going to be a problem you have to think through, and that's one reason why the green jobs business, a lot of these were low sort of value jobs that just go offshore right away, even if GE invents the windmill technology. And we haven't figured that out. That has to be thought through a lot more, and that's just sort of a caution when we say, China's investing and doing all these things. That's all true, but it's not simply a matter of just inventing the technology. There's also the wage differential and raw materials differential and price differential that's a big part of that equation.
And trade issues, certainly.
Yes,
as well.
sure.
We will return to Steve calling for tariffs here in just a second. But first, I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that please write down questions for our panel on cards, and I'll bring them up here shortly. But I want to stay on this topic, not just because I moderated a manufacturing panel last week. Manufacturing innovation is part of energy innovation, and manufacturing jobs are a key part of keep capturing the benefits of innovation here. So back to our two Senate staffers, how much of the action we might see in the next Congress, because this does seem to be an area where Democrats and Republicans agree, could be focused on issues like revitalizing American manufacturing and could in fact have an energy component.
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I think that Steve Hayward's exactly right. I mean, when he points to the issues, there's also sugar beets, I believe, in the Dakotas, but but besides that, exactly right. Also dependent on subsidy, where we can have a policy, a tax credit, or a clean energy standard, a renewable energy standard, name it, and that's not necessarily going to fix the manufacturing problem we have. We want manufacturing in this country. And I think that, and happily, that's not a particularly partisan issue. Where it becomes partisan is when your solution is to erect trade barriers and this sort of thing. And we see a lot of that, and we'll see more of it. So I think that manufacturing, along with general R&D and efficiency investments generally, are kind of the sweet spot for the sort of mom and apple pie political discussion in this Congress. Now, I also agree that it's not ideal to have a lot more of the same. And I think, believe me, me and, well, at least me and many of my colleagues are terribly uncreative. You have a lot of policy recycling, and we do need more ideas. But I'm also a conservative, so I like the trajectory of history. So we want to do more work in that area. But I think it's important not to underestimate the challenge of communicating this politically. The polling is clear. People like energy innovation. A lot of people would like to do something about climate change. Even more people would like to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. But when you put it in a way that they understand that they have to have some sacrifice involved, whether it's higher power rates or higher gas rates, the numbers completely fall. I was completely. There was this goal out here, a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That was sort of the catchphrase of the last couple of years. And I would be hard-pressed to find a less motivating political slogan. What we need to talk about is this, of course, I'm biased to Senator Lugar's message since he's wise enough to pay my salary. But what he talks about is, how can we make the American economy the most energy efficient economy in the world? Why do we want it to be energy efficient? Because that means that's another step towards being the most competitive economy in the world. And this is the sort of thing you have to talk about. We need to move the discussion again, I guess, to where I started, to what people care about. And people do care about manufacturing. They do care about saving money.
Well, the energy manufacturing nexus is a hard one to get your hands on. We held a hearing on it, was it 2008? And it was interesting in the sense that what we found out is after we did the Rising with the Gathering Storm and competes, that we're front loading, we're getting PhDs, we're trying to authorize and do good things there. But we had an energy manufacturing, or what do you want to call it, hearing. We found out the greatest need when the industry people came forward, and this was obviously pre-economy falling off the cliff, was this issue of skilled workforce. That you want to call it a green job, I'll call it a nuclear job. A welder is going to weld up a windmill. He'd be more qualified welding a nuclear pressure vessel, but those kinds of skilled labor jobs, we found the industry people actually, and the traditional industry people that I would think Republicans, favoring, whether it's gas or oil or nuclear, as well as the green energy people, solar or wind. We found these skilled labor jobs to be, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying create trade schools to put up solar panels. I'm talking, how do we train electrical linemen, because we need a lot more grid, and grid is going to be kind of the same whether it's a grid for renewable or a grid for a nuke. We found crying need in those areas and very high salaries. And so I guess my focus, and we did in the last energy bill, but it's still I think it's still a work in progress, because it's not fleshed out totally, is this whole area of building an energy infrastructure. And there was an excellent report, I think it was by the Bipartisan Policy Center. They got Bechtel involved on what it would take to build like a nuke plant, base load, and huge number of man hours and jobs. Not that we've built a nuke plant, but you've thought through these things, and these are the same people that are going to do transmission. They're the same linemen, the skilled labor jobs. So I guess I would not necessarily say, there's a plant doing, churning out things, okay, as much as building an infrastructure over the next 30 years is perhaps the right way to look at that issue. And there, I think there seems to be a demand and a need, and it's matching how we build up the training versus the demand for it. We don't want to overbuild community colleges and everything when there's not enough demand. There's always that fine balance point. But that's what we think the sweet spot is right now.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a great time. I've enjoyed interrogating you, and now I'd like to let the audience. So do we have some questions? Fantastic. Thank you, Jesse. All right. Okay, here's a question for the panel. Per Stephen's comment, welfare reform came from the bottom up. You've talked about Washington. What about governors, mayors? What are the possibilities we see rising up from the local and state level?
Well, I think, interject briefly. It's harder on the energy field because it's a different scale issue than other kinds of social policy. And I mean, actually, Martin Morrow could answer this question much better than I could with this, the cluster idea. I think that's where you're going to see ideas come in, and that's going to depend upon some of the regional and state comparative advantages of their knowledge base and industry base, of that kind. You're not going to get non-fossil energy innovation out of North Dakota because they're doing the fossil fuel boom. Ditto for Texas. California, everyone's talking about forever. They're going to keep pushing this, of course. A lot of these I look at so far, it's been a mixed bag. I think, so I'm a little less optimistic that this is going to come from the bottom up in terms of from the ordinary political process. But in this case, I think bottom up means, people like us pushing the ideas along and thinking about or reorienting our thinking towards innovation instead of mandates and regulating and blunt force trauma to get us to energy.
Right. Did you thought?
Yeah, well, I would say I think the sort of innovation hub concept, which Mark has done a lot of work on, we have, and Third Way, among others, is really an idea of moving towards a somewhat more sort of distributed innovation ecosystem, where one of the strengths of that system is the fact that it is sort of fairly decentralized, kind of taking advantage of regional strengths, comparative advantage, that kind of thing. And I think that is the kind of model that starts to build that kind of bottoms-up sort of support for a federal framework that can support that kind of regional innovation. Michael and I wrote a piece actually suggesting that the California stem cell effort might be an interesting model for state efforts, where at a time when the federal government really was funding very little innovation and stem cell research, California sort of went forward and funded its own regional effort, and that effort then led to a whole series of kind of copycat efforts in other states around the country. It obviously started to really shift the politics around stem cell research at the federal level, and also kind of created a whole network, collaborative network, not only nationally but internationally, with the sort of California effort collaborating with a whole set of efforts elsewhere around the world. So, there's an interesting kind of example of that. But I also want to just kind of support Steve's concept that there's something larger here, around actually kind of first and foremost understanding that there is a sort of an innovation challenge that cuts across a whole series of set of these concerns, and sort of moving the larger dialogue, and framework as we think about energy, even as we think about climate, to understanding those things as fundamentally innovation challenges, I think is the first step in really kind of building a lasting consensus to do energy innovation and do it right.
Yeah, I suppose, like Senator Lugar, I'm always optimistic, and I'm extremely optimistic about what's happening at the state and local level. And I'd say it's pretty fair to say that over the next couple of years, that's where the most action is going to happen. Indiana is, depending on the day, about 96 or 97% dependent on coal. It's generally fair to say that if a policy can work in Indiana, it can work in about any state in the country. And you're seeing a remarkable amount of creative thinking and innovation going on. I mean, right now there are two proposals before the Regulatory Commission in Indiana to have feed-in tariffs. And it's the utilities that have put these proposals up. I mean, feed-in tariffs in the middle of the country. I mean, this is the sort of thing that, 18 months ago you only think of Germany. I'm not saying feed-in tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea, but here it is. It's coming from the ground up. There's a university in Indianapolis, IUPUI, that has an energy center that has a very good name, the Richard G. Lugar Renewable Energy Center. But since its creation, it has had an amazing power to convene academics, community leaders, business leaders, and just by putting them in the room, you've seen a huge amount of collaboration that you just didn't see before. And this gets at, I think, one of the chief obstacles that we have, which is you talk about if you talk about green jobs, or you talk about saving money in your home through better windows or more insulation, or you talk about electric cars, is people just don't believe it. They don't believe that it's real. They don't believe that it can work for them. And by having all of these grassroots efforts that are actually doing things. There's a group called the Energy Systems Network in Indianapolis that is actually putting electric vehicles onto the road there. Whether they'll hit 1 million vehicles in the country in the next decade, I don't know. But you know what? The people in Indianapolis will see that it can happen. And that's what we need across the country, and you're starting to see it happen. And if it can happen in Indiana, it can happen anywhere.
I would point out that I spent a lovely fall week in Anderson, Indiana, touring several energy innovation facilities, where they are very optimistic about the possibilities of electric cars or LED lighting, a bunch of other sort of advancements. But, and this leads into the next question from Jesse Jenkins at Breakthrough, they're also very concerned in Anderson about China. And they're very concerned about the Chinese competition and the sort of things Steve was talking about earlier about being undercut. And Jesse's question plays right into that, which is how large are those concerns on both sides of the aisle about competing with China, and how do you deal with that? How do you compete with China in an innovation frontier and otherwise?
Well, we're not going to outspend China. So all these discussions about how we get more money for R&D or whatever it is, I mean, we need to have these discussions, but those aren't going to be the solution. I mean, the solution are going to be innovators and entrepreneurs. And how do we release their energies? It's through having a tax code that makes sense. I mean, we can't talk about energy innovation without talking about corporate tax rates in this country. These are interconnected pieces. So I think that we really have to look at that very basic, what is government here to do but set the rules of the road so that people can go out and innovate and create business, and we can't just fix it from Washington.
Josh?
I think we certainly can't just fix it from Washington, but I think there are two things missing right now that we could see happen. One is urgency. I mean, the fact that China, and depending on the issue, Germany and the United Kingdom and Spain and South Korea are moving so far ahead and figuring out ways to develop the private-public partnerships they need to create new businesses, to allow entrepreneurs to step up and create companies and create jobs, is something that we do hear a little bit in the national dialogue, and it pops up and then disappears, but Americans need an optimistic vision in the future that they're striving for, but they also need an urgency, either a foil or other reason to motivate them to act on this issue versus another issue. Certainly China's rise in investment in clean energy can serve as that, particularly if you paint the picture of, does it matter if China is inventing and manufacturing all of the clean energy technologies we may ultimately adopt in the United States? Who care? Should we care? And if we do care, what are the ramifications of that? I think the other thing is, yes, it's up to ultimately the private sector to get us there. But there is a long history in the United States of the government providing either certainty or incentives or knowledge and resources that the private sector isn't able to do alone. In the post-partisan report and in a report we did separately, I mean, one of them is the fact that the United States, the Wright brothers, invented the airplane, and by the early 1920s, we had certainly lost the lead in that and had fallen far behind in innovation. Well, it was Calvin Coolidge who signed legislation creating a Civil Aeronautics Board to help with the kind of innovation that over the next 15 years led to the DC-3, led to the commercial aviation industry, and a lot of the steps leading up to that enabled the companies that helped win World War II and helped create the modern aviation industry get off the ground.
I would just, I'd make a couple of points. One, I would take issue with Neil. We are not going to outcompete China on the cheap. If we're actually serious about getting in this game, we're going to have to spend some real money on innovation. I'm all for R&D tax credits, things like that. They're great things. We should, lots of good reasons to do them. Have, above and beyond competing for clean energy markets such as they are. But those technologies, the technologies we have today are insufficient. They cost too much. They don't have the performance characteristics we need. The reality, and we see it in China, we see it to the degree here that we're investing in this stuff, is that the market for clean energy, such as it is entirely driven by public policy and mostly by public subsidies. There is no market for clean technology without substantial public subsidies. I think that creates a whole set of problems that we've only begun to really grapple with. If we are sort of serious about driving innovation, one is how do you move from subsidizing more of the same to making investments in technology that more rapidly drive performance and cost improvements, and I think we don't do a very good job of that right now. I think the second, frankly, I don't think anyone wants a trade war, but given that market is heavily subsidized one way or another by the public sector, I can see very little reason that any economy in the world is going to be able to sustain public subsidies for clean technologies if they don't have some mechanism to assure that at least some significant portion of those benefits accrue domestically. That's what we saw, with the stimulus, where we kind of it was so easily attacked for subsidizing, for the fact that X amount, much of that went to sort of foreign firms, components, things like that were manufactured elsewhere, and I think that's a big challenge for clean energy advocates, is figuring out how to set up the right mix of policies, incentives, investments in innovation and commercialization of clean energy technologies, such that they can they're sustainable, and they actually drive the technologies in the directions that we need them to be driven, which is to rapidly get better and cheaper.
Can I jump in on this a little bit to follow on and also dispute Josh just slightly? Actually, not just slightly, but hopefully make some consensus. You used a couple of terms that other people use today that sort of raise my caution flags, and it's sort of, we need incentives and certainty in this process. And let me put it this way. I think we want to redefine or be more precise about how we think about those two adjectives that are used a lot. Right now, incentives mean a tax subsidy, a tax break and/or subsidy for a technology that's presently uncompetitive, is not moving down in its cost sharp enough for the most part, and that opens the door to the special pleaders and the ethanol lobby and so forth. Our idea in our paper is we want incentives that drive down the costs of new technologies, or they lose their subsidy fast, which means you need death panels for research programs. So that'll be in our next paper. But the broader, more important point is that one we can talk about a little bit. But the related point is certainty. And one of the important things about an innovation agenda, however conceived and structured, is precisely that it is uncertain. I mean, some of the examples we made about, the things that led to the iPhone, well, there was no certainty in all the parts that came out of that research that was going to lead to this. No one could foresee this or some of the other great waves you've talked about. And so that's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem for the private sector, knowing when to jump in. It's a problem politically. It's really a problem, I want to say, for environmentalists who prize certainty above all else. That's why they're now grasping onto the Clean Air Act as the fallback position on the climate change, because that model worked in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and it's not working for this problem. And so that's going to be hard for us to give up the old way of thinking about certainty. And so all I'm saying is we need to redefine and be more precise about how we understand those ideas.
I mean, I think with, in terms of certainty in particular, we're hearing more of it now from the business community. We're hearing with the $1.9 trillion that is parked on the sidelines right now. Why is it parked on the sidelines? They are craving certainty. Yes, the iPhone wasn't created because that's what the government said they wanted, but the internet was. And there are certain times, there are specific times when laying a vision that's far into the future and saying this is what we want, this is what we need, this is for the good of national policy, private sector, entrepreneurs figure out how to get there. We're not going to dictate the technologies to get there, but we know, for example, that it doesn't make sense to be as reliant as we are on foreign oil. So we can decide, do we want to continue with drilling off our shores and incur the challenges and problems that has, or do we want to say it is in the national interest to gradually move off of fossil fuel for transportation, and private sector figure out how to do that. It provides some certainty at that level, but it's not picking winners and losers or dictating the types of technologies we need. In terms of incentives, certainly we agree with that. I mean, we want to see incentives provided to help get technologies out there, but then if they don't work, they can fail on their own.
Well, see, here's where we're long conversations, we'd sort this out.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to go one last question here, and I would like you all to be quick in your responses, but I think it's a good one. It comes from the audience. It's about the Deepwater Horizon, but it could just as easily be about 9/11 or about Ronald Reagan finding out that his secretary paid more in taxes than GE. These are the cataclysmic events that spur big legislation, usually. The Patriot Act comes out of 9/11. Allegedly, someday we may see a drilling safety bill actually get passed because of the Deepwater Horizon. But do we need some sort of cataclysmic event, like, or even just $4 a gallon gas prices again, to drive an energy agenda? Or is it possible for Congress to actually do something about it in the absence of a major crisis? Why not, Steve? Go first.
Sadly, the answer is probably yes, but we actually had two cataclysmic energy events back in the 70s with the gas lines and the first price shocks. And by the way, I began to pick on Armand from earlier. He said, wouldn't we be talking about this in the absence of climate change? We were talking about this in the 70s before climate change became a salient issue. And if we'd been thinking about climate change then, Jimmy Carter wouldn't have said, let's do a lot more coal, right? Well, it didn't work for a variety of reasons, because that was the energy problem then was different than the one we're talking about now. But I could foresee, I still think the hinge of all this is oil prices at the global oil market. And you could either have natural forces bring us $4 a gallon gas here in the next few months, or you could have a geopolitical crisis give us $10 a gallon gas next week if Korea goes up or the Middle East goes up. And at that point, I think the problem becomes very acute. People say we are no longer want to be at the mercy of these epicycles, both the fossil fuel, the commodity cycle, but also the geopolitical vulnerability. And that would, I think, be the punctuated equilibrium moment of it.
Milton Friedman sort of famously observed that he saw his job as kind of creating good ideas that would then get picked up in a crisis. And so, I think certainly a crisis of some sort might help, but I think it's important to have the right ideas to pick up at that time. And I think as we get into some of these conversations about subsidies, about how you actually drive down the cost, how you drive innovation, I think there's a whole lot that actually needs to get worked out here about how to do this right. And I think one of my biggest concerns, just to get back to my original remarks here, is just that we're going to try to move too quickly without having, or I should say we'll be in too much of a hurry, without actually having gotten some clarity about how we need to actually create that energy innovation ecosystem that can succeed. So while I'm certainly wouldn't shy away from opportunities to advance this agenda wherever they come from, I think it's also you even see in the discussion here and some of the earlier discussions that I think there's a lot of there's some basic sort of intellectual and policy work that needs to be done, and needs to be done quickly, to sort of figure out how we actually do energy innovation in this country in a way that is more likely to succeed than sort of some of the past efforts that have failed.
John?
Well, I mean, I can only speak from legislating any energy bills. You know, we had I remember in 2000 we had this meltdown in the California pricing market. And that, you know, got Dianne Feinstein pretty wound up, obviously, and we had some pretty raucous hearings. And it took us from 2000 to 2005 to produce that energy bill, with several attempts in multiple sessions of Congress. But we did it. And then the 2007 energy bill was because we had high gas prices, and I think if you remember, President Bush, you know, promulgated a biofuels push, you know, and if you look at that energy bill, by and large, it had two big things in it: a CAFE standard and a biofuel standard. So energy bills, in the at least from the last go around, of course, the one prior to that was in '92, and that was coming out of the Gulf War. So there seems to be a track record of large events spurring action in the committee system. Not that it can't happen without it, but I think there is precedent for that. It's necessary, not necessarily sufficient, but it's certainly, you know, has been the precedent.
Either of you guys want to weigh in at the end?
Sure. Look, crises are always helpful. But
that guy from Chicago say, never mind.
Well, we did pass health care, and we did get financial regulatory reform passed. So crises are always helpful, but you know, they're neither sufficient nor do we wait for one. And you look at the deficit, and I think in the 90s in particular, there was concern: are we ever going to get the deficit under control, barring a huge crisis that changes the paradigm? Certainly, Ross Perot helped. But you know, President Clinton did get that under control. I think he and Democrats would say that Newt Gingrich and the Republicans taking over Congress was the crisis that was needed to get it done. But nonetheless, there were ideas that were in the ferment before that the political system was able to implement without a crisis. And I think that there are a ton of small steps over the next several years, along with building the kind of dynamic in the public and amongst the business community we need to get this done. And if we either think of it just in terms of what can this Congress get done, or the next one, or what are we going to debate in this presidential election cycle or the next, we're going to get caught flat-footed, and nothing's going to happen.
I would say if you want a crisis, or an acute crisis anyway, you can get one very easily. There's about 5 million barrels a day of spare capacity in the world, 4 of which are in Saudi Arabia. You get down to 2 million barrels a day of spare capacity, and you know, instead of sort of like this with oil prices, you start to get these with every little thing. And a couple, if there was a confrontation with Iran, a couple missiles into key facilities in Saudi Arabia would get you to Stephen Hayward's dream world over there. I don't know if it's a nightmare but I'd say that, you know, we're already in crisis. We're in a crisis every day. I keep two numbers above my desk. One is the number of Hoosiers who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the other one is the unemployment rate in Indiana. And if you fix energy, you won't fix these two numbers completely, but you can make a really big dent. And so our challenge is to communicate solutions that will make a difference and that make sense, and that's completely doable. We just have to work really hard. I mean, you know, it's just like your mother says, right? You know, hard work can get you a long way, and luckily we have very good leadership, in particular on the Energy Committee in the Senate with Senators Bingaman and Murkowski, and a lot of other hardworking people. And you know, we'll continue our outreach with the House as well. We can't give up just because of a few headlines in the New York Times.
Well, thank you all so much. You've been a wonderful panel, been a wonderful audience, and we've had wonderful hosts. So thank you all.
Before people start to leave, let me just wrap up in just a couple of minutes. I want to make 3 quick points. First of all, thank you, Jim. Second point is, let me just take a quick effort to try to sum up, I think, in 3 areas. One, sort of the broad, very hard to sum up today. I think today was an excellent conversation. I hope you all agreed. But seemingly at the top level, what I heard was, particularly from Marty Hoffer, we need a vision about where we want to go, how we're going to get there, which is part of a strategy. We also need reasons that are more than just a single unitary reason to drive this. We've articulated, I think, a number of people today, the different kinds of motivations that we could have for driving a clean energy innovation strategy. Part of that also, what I heard on the last panel, is we need clarity, modesty, and no hype. We really shouldn't oversell what we're trying to do here, because at the end of the day, it comes back to bite us. We really need to be modest about what we're trying to sell. This isn't going to save the entire economy or create millions and trillions of jobs. It will do important things, and it needs to be done, but we shouldn't oversell it. Second point is about implementation. What I heard today, a theme was we need both the public and the private sectors to be part of this solution. That neither one of them could do it alone. We need both research and deployment. We need the short term and the long term, the breakthrough and the incremental, the less risky and the more risky. And it's really trying to bring both of those together. And part of, I think, the problem with this debate is that it's been this kind of less filling, tastes great debate, and it really is both of those together. And then finally, on the politics, what I heard was we need to really try to tie this to more than just an energy debate. We need to tie it to growth. I think there are ways to tie it to growth. We need to also be talking about incremental solutions. That I think that the time of grand master solutions is not here today, and what we can and should be working on and putting our politics together is about incremental solutions where we can make progress. And the last point, what I heard is we need, I don't want to use the word tax and investment, we need tax incentives and investment. In other words, we need to enable and support the private sector through policies, but that also public sector policies can make a difference. I can't close without, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the people who really just made this event possible. I mentioned Nathan Cummings Foundation, which I'll mention again, really appreciate their support for this, but the people who really did all the work and just let me and some of the other folks that really enjoy this is Luke Stewart on our staff, Catherine Engstad, Andrea Matus, who is really the lead on putting all this together, Matt Stapp, and then Matt Horahan. Matt, do you want to just stand up? Matt is does clean energy policy, and he really was the one that was working late and doing all the hard work of all of this, putting it together. And then on the breakthrough staff, Yale Borofsky and Sarah Mauser, who again did really a lot of help and put this all together. So please join me in thanking the great staff that made this possible.